Well, I'm here in New Mexico publicizing my book, Secret Mesa, Inside Los Alamos National Laboratory. And Los Alamos is just 30-some miles from Santa Fe.
Is your book tour just in New Mexico, and where have you gone within New Mexico?
Well, this is the beginning for me, and I started in Albuquerque and went to Los Alamos. And then after this, I don't really know. It's an evolving thing.
Since your book is about Los Alamos, tell us about what it was like to go to that town that you wrote about and what the audience was like.
Well, it was really interesting. I have to say I was a little nervous about it because Los Alamos is a community that's been written about so much, and not always kindly or well. There are a lot of really loony articles out there about Los Alamos that have really no connection to reality. And of course, people come to the institution, which was the birthplace of the atomic bomb and has conducted weapons research for 50 years. They come to the institution with certain prejudices, naturally. So I was nervous to be propped up in front of these people speaking at the Bradbury Science Museum. But I was stunned to find that they were very welcoming, very interested, and very supportive, actually, of the book, even though I was critical in some ways and didn't spare any words describing the kind of community it is. But they were happy that it was fair to them, that it was balanced, and that pleased me very much.
Last night, did you get a feel, is that when you were in Los Alamos, did you get a feel for who was in the audience? Was it residents that work at Los Alamos? Was it people from Santa Fe? Did you get any sort of feeling from the questions they asked?
It was almost all people from Los Alamos, and it was a wide variety of people, young people working at the laboratory, older people who had been there for most of their careers, all kinds of people, men and women whose only connection to the place was that they came there with their husbands and didn't even understand what their husbands did in the beginning, that sort of thing. Lots of good stories, lots of interesting people.
We're talking also about your book, Secret Mesa, Inside Los Alamos National Laboratory. Tell us from the beginning, what is Los Alamos, and why did you choose to write a book about it?
Well, Los Alamos is the place where the first atomic bomb was produced. It was a huge research project called the Manhattan Project, and it was a response to the suspicion that Hitler may have the technology whereby his scientists could make an atomic weapon. So they worked very hard, spent billions of dollars, billions of then wartime dollars, to develop one or two weapons to use if they needed to. And Los Alamos was chosen because it's isolated. It was a good place to keep secrets. And then after the war was over, after they used the atomic weapon, as we know, the laboratory continued to thrive. There was some thought that it would be closed, but then that became clear it was needed because Russia was developing weapons, or the Soviet Union was developing weapons. In any case, they've been there all this time, studying and making nuclear weapons.
Remind us again, when was the first atomic bomb dropped?
Well, the United States is the only country that's ever used an atomic weapon in war, and it was in August 1945.
Where did that happen?
Well, it was first dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, and then a few days later, Nagasaki.
Can you tell us more about the repercussions of that? Were there casualties? How many? And how did that affect the war?
Well, everything about that incident is still questioned and studied and crawled through by public policy people, scientists, everyone. The effects of it resonate to today. I mean, a few years ago when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of that event and the end of World War II, people were still discussing, should the bomb have been used? Were the Japanese ready to surrender? Would they have? The rationale for using it was that it would bring the war to a quick conclusion and save many lives. There were millions of American soldiers that were poised to invade Japan to bring this war to an end. And all of those people might, or not all, but many of those people might have lost their lives if the bomb had not been used. Now, the opposing viewpoint is, of course, that it was an immoral act, should never have been done, and many Americans feel as though it shouldn't have been the United States that did it, somehow placing us in a different category morally, somehow. But those things are always going to be discussed. I'm not sure there'll ever be a conclusion to that discussion. And in terms of casualties, that's not even known for sure. In Hiroshima, I believe maybe 100,000 people died. Something significant happened soon before that. United States bombers started firebombing Japanese cities, so people died by the thousands in other Japanese cities too. Those who don't understand the difference between the use of an atomic weapon and firebombing say dead is dead. Doesn't matter how you die, you just die. Well, the critical thing about atomic weapons is that you can kill many more people with one airplane, and the density of killing is so horrible. More people per square foot in Hiroshima died than did in any firebombed city. Those are some of the arguments that are talked about. And when the Smithsonian was preparing the Enola Gay exhibit, you remember the flap over that. Some people thought Japan was being too softly treated. People thought that it ought to be told more truthfully. We're going to be discussing this forever, I think.
Remind us again, what is the Enola Gay and what was the controversy over that exhibit?
Enola Gay was the bomber that took the weapon and dropped it over Hiroshima. And there was going to be an exhibit at the Smithsonian. I don't have a lot of memory about this, but just the way it was written about in terms of what was done, the bomb being dropped, it disgruntled American veterans. It made America look, and this, by the way, this exhibit didn't actually end up being this way. There was so much controversy about how it was being presented. American veterans of World War II hated the thought that Americans would be portrayed as the evil people in this conflict. I mean, in any war, evil things are done on both sides, and people felt that we owed no apologies to Japan, but they owed apologies to us. And that was some of the stuff that was being talked about. It was good, I think, that we all had to think about this. That was the important talking that was being done during that 50th anniversary.
In your book, you discuss a lot of what's going on at Los Alamos today. How has Los Alamos changed from the Cold War period? What were we trying to do at Los Alamos during the Cold War from 1945 on? And now in the post-Cold War world, what are they doing at Los Alamos?
Well, during that Cold War period, of course, the laboratory was working on nuclear weapons, refining their art, making better and more efficient weapons, and serving their client, the Department of Defense. They were also all that time working on other science, and that's something that people don't always know about. And since the end of the Cold War, they have tried to find another focus for their technology. However, nuclear weapons are still very important. We have a lot of them in our stockpile, and their concern is being a good steward of those weapons so that, God forbid, if they should ever have to be used, they work properly so that the military has confidence in them, and so that the natural degradation of materials in nuclear weapons is understood so that people can understand how they might perform. That's one whole important area of research at the laboratory that has also incidentally stabilized their budgetary problems. After the end of the Cold War, there was a state of flux for the laboratory, not really understanding what was going to happen and how they would be involved in national life.
You mentioned the Department of Defense. Explain to us what department oversees Los Alamos. Where do they get their funding? How does that work?
The Department of Energy is the overseer for Los Alamos National Laboratory and all the other laboratories. And the money comes from the American taxpayer. They're funded by Congress.
Now, how did you research this book? Did you research it in Washington? Did you live in Los Alamos? And what papers did you read, and who did you interview?
I spent a lot of time in Los Alamos, and I should explain that this book was meant to be, and it's what I think I ended up with, a portrait of the community and of the laboratory and portraits of the people who live and work there. And so the most important part of my research was being there. I spent a lot of time there, and I did over 100 formal interviews and many more informal interviews, and read probably every book that's available about the history of the laboratory. And well, it was a tremendous research project. I can't begin to tell you how many megabytes of computer disks of information I have, not to mention the stack of books of transcribed interviews I have. So it's a big project.
When did you begin your research, and how long did the book take you to write?
I started in 1992. Started really by visiting there the first time. And it took 3 or 4 years to finish the project.
Where do you live normally?
I live in Minnesota, which, and that's the first question I usually get from interviewers is, why would someone from some 1,400 miles away decide to do a book on a laboratory in New Mexico? And, you know, first of all, I think there is real merit in accounts written by people who aren't too close, who don't have a lot of assumptions, lifetime assumptions, possibly, if you're from New Mexico, about an institution. And beyond that, I came here working on a news story and was immediately fascinated with the place and wanted to know more, and eventually it became a book.
Tell us about your background. Is this your first book? And it sounds like you were a reporter. What is your background?
In my past, I have been a beat reporter, a science and medical reporter. I have written for newspapers and magazines and peer-reviewed journals and for science museums, and I have a varied background that prepared me to do something like this.
Where did you go to college?
I went to the College of St. Catherine in St. Paul, Minnesota.
What did you study there?
Actually, I'm a literature major, and then I went back to school to take science courses because I decided I wanted to be a science reporter.
Why?
Well, I have read a lot of good science writers, and I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's needed. I enjoy being around research scientists and doctors, and I like the process of translating difficult information so that regular people can understand it. And I also think that's very important. Our lives are just entangled in technology, and we benefit and suffer from technology. And I think everyday folks ought to know what it's all about, because we have to make decisions.
Tell us about why you called the book Secret Mesa, and did you go into Los Alamos Lab yourself, and what did you see?
Well, of course, I went into the laboratory, and I did go behind the fence, which is what they call secure areas, and I was escorted, of course. And I called it Secret Mesa because it's on this isolated high plateau on a mesa, and it began as a very secret, obviously, a very secret installation, and it was closed. It was still a secret installation and a secret town until the 50s. You just couldn't go visit there. It was, they have gates, and one of the towers, one of the guard towers is still there on the main road into town. And you had to jump through a few hoops to get into town. So, and I think that the beginnings of the town, the Cold War habits of secrecy, the necessity for secrecy, still resonate there. It is still a community that is trying to figure out how to be more open, how to be more giving of information to the public. I think now they want the public to understand them and appreciate them and not make knee-jerk responses to their research, which is not just weapons research. That's really important. They feel as though they're painted by a very broad brush. There's research there into the human genome. There's an AIDS database there that is serving researchers in AIDS all over the world. There's so much going on there. Materials science research that affects our cars, our pop cans, you know, it affects a lot of things.
Tell us, if you're an average citizen, not a reporter or writer, but if you wanted to go and visit Los Alamos, could you look around, or how could you learn more about Los Alamos?
Well, of course you can go there. The first time I went there, I had no clearance, I had no appointments. I just walked into town. It's a town with normal neighborhoods, and the laboratory is by and large fairly open. They do like people to check in with their visitors center, and I didn't do that, and as a result some goofy things happened. I was driving around on the roads up there, and I'd stop and take a picture of what I thought was the Santa Fe National Forest. Well, it was, but it was much more than that. It was laboratory property, and immediately a little runabout vehicle did a U-turn in the middle of the highway, came and sat beside me until I drove away. Didn't say anything to me, just watched. And then another time it happened, and then I began to realize this wasn't just the Santa Fe National Forest, there was something else going on there. And I came to understand then what that was all about. They have a security force. They watch people very carefully. There's more plutonium at Los Alamos than anywhere in this country.
Did you ever see plutonium when you were there?
Actually, I didn't. I begged and pleaded to be allowed to go into TA-55, their plutonium research facility. And then after I finished with the book, they did take reporters through. And I've been promised that next time they do it, I get to go. And I really would like to.
In your book, you've obviously interviewed a great number of scientists at the laboratory. Tell us about some of the more unusual people in town that you may have spoken with.
Well, town folk or research folk, because there are unusual people in both departments.
Either one, whichever you think might be of interest to the story.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to the weapons folk, of course, because they're very interesting and shed light on very scary and interesting topics like nuclear terrorism. And I talked to a robotics expert who is just a crazy man, a wild man, inventive guy who's making robots that are independent. He puts them down and lets them figure out the environment they're in, little robotic ants and other weird things.
Did you speak to any people who are anti-nuclear or against the nuclear plant?
Well, of course, and there's one fellow in town. He's notorious. His name is Edward Grothus, and he refers to himself as Eduardo de los Alamos. And he's very colorful. He has a salvage business in town that is full of old lab stuff, basically. He has bought up their garbage, the stuff they don't want anymore, some of it very valuable and still usable by people who need scientific equipment and can't afford the most expensive stuff. And he's a peace activist. This is it.
Is that him?
This is him, in front of what he refers to as the black hole, which is the place where he keeps all of his stuff. And he is, interestingly, a former lab employee, and he's lived in the town since 1949, and he stays there even though he hates the business of the laboratory because, as he said, all of my friends are there, all of my enemies are there, where else would I go? And he's tolerated, which is an interesting comment on the community, I think. they're big boys and girls with big shoulders, and they can take a lot of criticism, including from Eduardo, who is kind of like that eccentric uncle who's kind of a pain in the ass, but everybody puts up with him because he's part of the family. And this is a very interesting guy.
You've brought something with you here today. It looks like a can. Can you tell us what it is and the story behind it?
Well, this is a can that says organic plutonium and has a mushroom cloud on it, and it's from the reactors of Los Alamos, New Mexico, the home of the atomic bomb. Well, of course, it's not really plutonium. That would not be good. But it is something that has, I think it's peas or corn, but it's been relabeled by Eduardo de Los Alamos, and he sells it in his store. You know, it's like a 79-cent can of peas that he's selling for $5, I think. But the interesting thing is he sent one of these to President Clinton. Nobody laughed. I don't think it was considered a funny thing, and a couple of Secret Service agents showed up at his door and questioned him thoroughly, you know, hours, I think, and in the end realized it was just a publicity stunt and nothing harmful, and Mr. Grothus said they were actually very nice people. You know, he kind of made friends with them. So this is the kind of thing that he does. It's fun.
As a reporter, how do you find someone like Mr. Grothus? Are you in the town looking for that kind of character? Did you read about him? How'd you find that kind of source?
It wasn't hard to find Ed Grothus. He finds everybody else. There are a lot of articles written about him. I read something in Scientific American, I think. He's had television appearances and all kinds of things. He was the least difficult person to find. There are other people that you have to be very convincing to get them to talk to you. And just in terms of the townspeople, I had one woman say to me, "What kind of book are you writing?" I mean, she was really cautious. She said, "We've been burned so many times, you won't get anybody to talk to you if you don't prove to them somehow, by force of will, if nothing else, that you're planning to write a balanced piece." And so I was lucky enough that I did that and got a lot of candid remarks from people.
As an author, how do you talk to your sources and convince them that you're trying to write a balanced account?
Very carefully, very carefully. I don't know, you know, I don't even know if I can explain what that is. It's something that you learn to do. Connect with people on some level and make them feel that they can trust you, that you're not going to do wrong by them, that you're going to honor in some way what they do. I think it's different in a confrontational interview and in investigative reporting. I wasn't doing that. And also in Los Alamos, this is critically important, you have to know how to speak their language. If you don't know the words, if you don't understand at least the most rudimentary aspects of their technology, the window blinds go down pretty quickly, and you can see it happen and you know you're in trouble. So preparation is an important part of it.
What sticks out in your mind the most is something that surprised you about Los Alamos that you found out in the course of writing this book? What was the biggest surprise to you, if there was one?
Well, the biggest surprise, just in terms of function in the process of doing the book, was how eager people were to talk and tell their story, and how much they could tell. They weren't as secretive as I thought they'd be. I mean, there's a lot of that still, and there are a lot of things that they're very careful not to talk about. They're good at it. But I also, in terms of the things I learned, I was surprised at how involved the laboratory is in counterproliferation, how involved they are in intelligence, in terms of what's going on now, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And I heard stories from them that just scared the willies out of me. I mean, it's scary stuff, this terrorism business.
So, would you say these stories were about Russians, or are the scary stories more about other countries these days?
Well, the scary stories, at least what scared me, was the ease with which people with not good intentions may be able to get their hands on materials that can cause a big mess. You know, either by contamination with radioactive products or, God forbid, carry off a weapon. And we saw in the news not long ago that Russia could not account for a large number of suitcase-sized nuclear weapons, and that was something that they had talked about at Los Alamos when I was visiting there several years ago. The potential for that. There are weapons that are very destructive and very small. And as one guy told me, he said, you could drive one into New York in an old Corvair. You know? That's what frightened me most of all.
Tell us a little bit about Los Alamos and public opinion. In your book, you talk a little bit about the radiation experiments and how that information was released to the public. How do you think that is still unfolding today with the radiation experiments, and when were they?
Well, in terms of the radiation experiments, we do see stories once in a while, but I think that was a blip on the public consciousness that now that's over. There's other stuff, I suppose, to think about. But it's part of a continuing problem. I think that the public doesn't trust weapons scientists. Surprise. I mean, I don't think they trust government scientists. People don't trust the government, frankly. And so it's difficult for people in our institutions, our scientific institutions, our governmental institutions, to get people to really trust them. And for the laboratory, this is going to be a problem for a while, I think, just in terms of talking about materials or their work. I mean, everyone is always saying they're designing new weapons, aren't they? They're not supposed to be, of course. Well, no, maybe they are. I don't know. But they're never going to convince the public that they aren't.
Who do you hope reads this book, Secret Mesa? When you were writing it, did you have a certain reader in mind?
Well, I think it could be interesting to a lot of people. Anyone who grew up during the Cold War would certainly be able to hook into this, because we all grew up with that terror, that thought that it could all be over. And to know where a lot of the technology comes from could be interesting. For people who lived through World War II and understood at the end what brought it to a conclusion, it might be interesting to them. It's written so that it's accessible to anyone who has any interest in technology, in government science, in history, and also in good stories. I mean, there's some really interesting people in that town, and I got to talk to quite a few of them. So if nothing else, I think it's a good read.
Have you received any criticism from anyone on any side of the nuclear industry over this book?
Not from people in the industry, no. One gentleman last night wished that I had written more about the other science at the laboratory, and I do too. But I really think I wrote about the things that are most worrisome to everyday Americans. So I had to focus, and that's what I did. Maybe there's another book in all of that, I don't know.
That was exactly what I was thinking. Now that you've spent so many years on this book and it's published and you're out talking about it, have you had a chance to think about your next book, and what might that be about?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet. I'm very interested in the idea of storing nuclear or chemical wastes on Indian lands, and so I've been doing some research about that. I don't have a book contract on that yet. I would like to do more about Los Alamos National Laboratory or about the wider community. We'll just have to see. There's so much that can be written. It's a pretty deep well.
How do you think this book will sell? And who's your publisher, by the way?
The publisher is John Wiley & Sons, and I don't know how it will sell. I mean, that's a good question. You never know. And this is what I hear from my editor and from people in my publisher. You just don't know how to call it sometimes. What will interest people, what will pique their interest. It's a little magic.
Well, we thank you, Joanne Schreier, for spending some time with us to talk about your new book, Secret Mesa, Inside Los Alamos National Laboratory.
Thank you. Well, I'm here in New Mexico publicizing my book, Secret Mesa, inside Los Alamos National Laboratory. And Los Alamos is just 30-some miles from Santa Fe.
Is your book tour just in New Mexico, and where have you gone within New Mexico?
Well, this is the beginning for me, and I started in Albuquerque and went to Los Alamos. And then after this, I don't really know. It's an evolving thing.
Since your book is about Los Alamos, tell us about what it was like to go to that town that you wrote about and what the audience was like.
Well, it was really interesting. I have to say I was a little nervous about it because Los Alamos is a community that's been written about so much, and not always
Inside Los Alamos National Laboratory. Tell us from the beginning, what is Los Alamos and why did you choose to write a book about it?
Well, Los Alamos is the place where the first atomic bomb was produced. It was a huge research project called the Manhattan Project, and it was a response to the suspicion that Hitler may have the technology whereby his scientists could make an atomic weapon. So they worked very hard, spent billions of dollars, billions of then wartime dollars, to develop one or two weapons to use if they needed to. And Los Alamos was chosen because it's isolated. It was a good place to keep secrets. Very much.
Last night, did you get a feel, is that when you were in Los Alamos, did you get a feel for who was in the audience? Was it residents that work at Los Alamos? Was it people from Santa Fe? Did you get any sort of feeling from the questions they asked?
It was almost all people from Los Alamos, and it was a wide variety of people. Young people working at the laboratory, older people who had been there for most of their careers, all kinds of people, men and women, women whose only connection to the place was that they came there with their husbands and didn't even understand what their husbands did in the beginning, that sort of thing. Lots of good stories, lots of interesting people.
We're talking also about your book, Secret Mesa.
Kindly or well. There are a lot of really loony articles out there about Los Alamos that have really no connection to reality. And of course, people come to the institution, which was the birthplace of the atomic bomb and has conducted weapons research for 50 years. They come to the institution with certain prejudices, naturally. So I was nervous to be propped up in front of these people speaking at the Bradbury Science Museum. But I was stunned to find that they were very welcoming, very interested, and very supportive, actually, of the book, even though I was critical in some ways and didn't spare any words describing the kind of community it is. But they were happy that it was fair to them, that it was balanced, and that pleased me very. And then after the war was over, after they used the atomic weapon, as we know, the laboratory continued to thrive. There was some thought that it would be closed, but then that became clear it was needed because Russia was developing weapons, or the Soviet Union was developing weapons. In any case, they've been there all this time, studying and making nuclear weapons.
Remind us again, when was the first atomic bomb dropped?
Well, the United States is the only country that's ever used an atomic weapon in war, and it was in August 1945.
Where did that happen?
Well, it was first dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, and then a few days later, Nagasaki.
Can you tell us more about the repercussions of that?